So thank you, Joe, for coming out and having this conversation today on the history of barbecue. It's a topic that I'm really passionate about, but I think between the two of us, there's not a gap in information, I believe. There's still a lot more information, but I think we're two of the most knowledgeable people in the country on this particular subject.
I know you are. One of them.
I mean, you got a book to your name to prove how knowledgeable you are. Folks, just so you all know, Joseph Haynes is the author of Virginia Barbecue, A History. He's a noted barbecue cook, a Kansas City Barbecue Society Master Certified Barbecue Judge. He also has a Virginia Barbecue Proclamation. So you're in for a treat. You love barbecue, and this is where you need to be today. You got anything you want to share about yourself, Joe, before we get into this discussion?
No, you said it all. I'm just very happy to be here, and hopefully.
I guess I should give the folks a little bit of information about myself.
Yeah, definitely.
So just a little bit about myself. I'm from South Carolina originally. Been cooking a whole hog barbecue all of my life. Cooked my first one at age 11. I have cooked every animal domesticated in the American South, from the hog, goat, lamb, sheep, and cow. So I have covered the gamut. I have cooked in the ground in the direct heat pits, similar to how my ancestors. I could trace my barbecue lineage probably over 95 years. Within like different people where the barbecue tradition jump in and out of the family and then the community. And so I knew it went well into slavery with the techniques and the approach that we cook barbecue. So we're just going to get started quick into this. I think that was a good introduction about who we are. What made you get started into this barbecue research and this barbecue culture, Joe?
Well, I've always been fascinated by barbecuing. Even when I was a youngster, my dad used to raise hogs, and of course, we always ate barbecue. And when I was in high school, my first job at that point was at a local barbecue place, as a matter of fact. And that place was extremely busy. We cooked barbecue that was, in those days, Virginians didn't go around saying, hey, we got Virginian barbecue. We cooked barbecue. And it's kind of like when you go to China, you don't order Chinese food, right? You just order food. Well, we're in Virginia, we don't order Virginia barbecue, we order barbecue. And we had a fellow that would come up and visit every once in a while from North Carolina. And he would always bring a bottle of sauce, North Carolina style sauce, and we'd keep it under the counter for him. And the owner of the restaurant didn't like people to know about that. So when I was first hired, after a couple of weeks, I noticed that jar of sauce underneath the counter. And the place was full, and I reached down there and grabbed that jar of sauce, and I held it up and said, Mr. White, that was the guy's name. I said, what's this stuff doing here? And man, he grabbed that bottle real fast and put it back under the counter and said, don't you say that. Don't you pull that out. Because what we were serving was so different, It's very unique. And anyway, I've come to learn that it's a actual central Virginia style barbecue sauce. So what got me interested is, after I got out of college, I started playing around cooking barbecue and applying some of the things that I learned growing up, and some of the things I learned from the restaurant. And of course, those folks the people that run the restaurant didn't share their barbecue sauce recipe with me. So I started experimenting, trying to replicate it.
I know the feeling. You got to earn the barbecue sauce recipe.
Yeah. And so as I started traveling around, I would eat barbecue every chance I got. And I noticed North Carolina, barbecue was very different than what I grew up with. Noticed in Texas, it was very different. South Carolina was very different. Alabama was very different. Everywhere I'd go, it was nothing quite like exactly what we had at home. And so I started kind of cataloging that. And after a while, I realized, there's actually a unique style of barbecue in here in Virginia, and no one seems to have recognized it. So I'm going to get to the point here. I'm going to close this down because I'm kind of wandering. But so what got me started in this was I started wanting to know more about my family's history. And I realized that my mother's side of the family was Native American of ancestry. And it turns out that there's a tribe in Stafford County, the Potawatomi Indians of Virginia, And that is what the Traveler family was a big part of. So I started looking into that, and I found some of our food traditions and some of the things that I thought were weird about my mother's family were kind of tied back into the Native American thing. I was like, oh, okay, well, that kind of explains some of these. And so I got looking into Native American cookery. Anyhow, one thing led to another, and I realized that barbecuing in Virginia is a multicultural food. Southern barbecue is a food that did not exist before people of African ancestry were brought here in the 1600s. They were enslaved with also Native Americans, and they had to live with indentured Europeans. And all of them had very similar, in some ways, similar cooking techniques, and they blended their cooking techniques and they created this thing called Southern barbecuing, which is unique in the world, right? You know, you pick up books on barbecue nowadays, barbecuing and everything from the Hebrew priests in the Old Testament barbecuing a lamb on the altar, temple altar, to somebody cooking a hot dog on a grill is barbecue nowadays. But up until the 20th century, barbecuing in this country was Southern barbecue, right? Southern barbecuing. It's very unique. No one else in the world does it like Southerners have traditionally done it. And so, after a while, and I'm going to close up after I have enough material, I'll do
Joe, I think you're going out.
After a while, I said I was doing
I can't.
You hear me good now?
I can't hear you, but I'm gonna take over just for a few minutes. I can't hear you for some reason, but like how I became involved with barbecue, like for me, my inspiration for barbecue, I just always enjoyed being around barbecue, and barbecue to me was always cooking generally the whole hog. It wasn't cooking any other parts of the animal. It was the whole hog, no piece parts. What really got me inspired to do this work, though, was I realized the African American contribution to American barbecue, or Southern barbecue, was omitted a lot in history as well as in recent times. And it wasn't by fault that they were omitted. They weren't allowed to read and write. And so I felt like part of my purpose in this work is to define the years and centuries of oral tradition that I have possessed within me that was passed down, and then share that knowledge with the public, because a lot of that stuff, if I don't document it or go through the processes, a lot of stuff is in the literature. It will actually go into the cemetery, and people will never know certain little nuances that may be in the conversation. So that's kind of been my motivation for this particular thing. But you hit on something, Joe, and I want you to speak to this tradition of Southern barbecue. I practice what I call South Carolina barbecue, which is part of the Southern barbecue landscape. And this age of being over nearly 400 years, that's a long time up until the beginning of the 20th century, is something remarkable. I would really go far and say up until like the 1940s, 1950s, you saw Southern barbecue from all the way from Virginia all the way to Eastern Texas.
Oh yeah.
And the barbecue pits almost look identical. Just so people know, the barbecue pits almost look identical. And part of that reason, back during that time, we didn't have Facebook or Google. A lot of the information went with the people. And if you look at the map of slavery in the 1860s, that clearly kind of shows the path of where Southern barbecue reside. And if you look at this particular picture, you'll see things such as Alabama, North Carolina, Texas, and Georgia, and they all cooking in earth dug pits. So exactly right. I want you to go and talk about this 400 years in Virginia and why Virginia was one of the earliest places, was the earliest place before the United States even became the United States with cooking barbecue. What was the influences? What was some of the backstory? Because I think people need to understand that backstory to really understand this barbecue tradition.
Right. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Oh, okay. That slide that you have up there, I want everybody to take a good look at that, because You know, we're told by the mass media today that barbecuing in our country in the South was brought here from the Caribbean. If you look at those photographs, you cannot find anybody doing that right there in the Caribbean. You can't find a record of it. It's not there. That is completely unique in the world of barbecuing, what you're showing in those slides. Now, in Virginia, what happened is a lot of things that created this American culture incubated in Virginia, right? Virginia was known as a cultural hearth, right? Which is where new culture, the new culture in the United States was formulated. The specifics in Virginia that made barbecuing emerge was, first of all, there was a very close relationships between settlers and Native Americans, and there were family relationships. And when these settlers would take Native American wives, these Native American women would cook in the way that they knew how to cook. Now, when enslaved Africans were brought here, believe it or not, right? And this is something, I've got a new book that's coming out hopefully fairly soon, and I'm exploring the Native American influences, the African influences on this thing about Southern barbecuing, because that's the part where when you pick up a barbecue history book, you're gonna hear them say like two main things. It's a West Indies way of cooking, which it is not. And I have an entire exhaustive chapter on that phrase, a West Indies way of cooking, where I analyze it to the nth degree, trace it back to the first person who said it and the context of where it came from. You're going to hear that it's a West Indies way of cooking, and then you're going to talk about how the Indians in Brazil cooked on a bucan and the Native Americans in Haiti cooked on a barbacoa. And that's what they're going to focus on. However, I have found accounts of people in Africa drying meat on hurdles and taking that meat, and some of them used salt, some of them didn't, and they would take that meat to market. They would cure the meat. The guys describe it as fire smoked meat that was cured, right? And what they were doing in one operation, they were roasting the meat, they were drying the meat, and they were smoking the meat. So they were cooking it, curing it, exactly, in one operation. And they take that meat and they wrap it up in bundles, and they take it to villages and they sell it. Well, you look at the Buccaneers in the Caribbean. They would take meat, they would cut it into strips. They didn't do whole hogs. They cut it into strips, exactly like people in Africa would do with elephants and gazelle and other animals that they would kill there. When the Buccaneers would take these wild pigs in the Caribbean and they would cut the meat into strips, they put it on those bucans and they would roast it and they would dry it and they would smoke it in one operation and they'd sell it. And that's how they made their living. The Maroons in Jamaica, when they made Jamaican jerk, they would hunt a wild boar, they debone it, they cut the meat and they put it on those they didn't call those grills barbecues or barbacoas, they called them patatas, right? Which shows that it's a very different way of thinking about this, but it was very similar to what went on in Africa, very similar to what the Buccaneers did, very similar to what Native Americans did, where they would take this meat and they would put it on those grills and they would dry it and they would roast it and smoke it all in one operation. And the Maroons in Jamaica would then take that smoked cured meat and they cooked smoked cured meat, they wrap it up in leaves and they take it to villages and they made a living out of it.
And not to cut you off, but I'm quite sure that when they were smoking it to preserve it, they would if they get hungry, they would take a piece of that meat and eat it then and there once they knew it was right.
Exactly right. They did.
And when you think about
bingo.
And when you think about they're in a hot climate, they had to cook this meat to preserve it because they just had a fresh game, fresh kill.
Exactly
they
right.
They couldn't wait and just like let it sit up. They knew they had to get it cooked because otherwise they'd get a lot of bacteria, then they have food poisoning. So they were really practicing good food handling practices back then.
Exactly.
And so you're seeing this common thing with these. When I was in Trinidad, these bottom two pictures is what you were seeing a lot of this barbecue literature talking about. This is the earliest form of barbecue, but it doesn't look like the barbecue of in the U.S. South that was low and slow.
It doesn't look like anything you just showed in previous slides.
It looked nothing like that. I mean,
nothing like that. Completely different. One did not come from the other. Just didn't.
And so in most of the, after a while in history, the indentured servants wasn't doing that work. The indigenous Native American community was pushed out the way. And correct me if I'm wrong, and the only people who was really doing that physical labor, and I'm sure they evolved the cooking process over their time, was the enslaved Africans.
Right. Exactly.
Early on, the indigenous was there, but then once slavery, American slavery went into full effect, you might see Indians and blacks mixing, but most of the old archival pictures, generally you saw up to a certain time frame. You probably got more pictures than me, Joe, but most of the pictures I have seen, you'll see generally some African American cooking, or if they're cooking, if there's a picture being taken, there's some Caucasian or European ancestry, they take a photo out, and then they look like they dressed in their Sunday attire.
They take the credit, but they don't do the work.
And so that's just the reality. That's what happens. And so people need to understand where this barbecue tradition lies. And I know people like to talk about Texas barbecue, but we need to pay homage to certain things first. We need to look at Virginia. And another thing that I think, and you know more details about this than me, is about the political rallies that happened in Virginia and what was the purpose of those political rallies. And since Virginia was the oldest colony in the New World, in the United States, those activities happened there, and to get votes, what people fail to realize, how they got votes, they serve people barbecue and they serve them whiskey.
All right.
And the people who was cooking that barbecue was the enslaved Africans. People making that whiskey that goes on with barbecue was enslaved Africans. And so you see this culture of barbecue and moonshine, or barbecue and whiskey. It's been going on a long time together. It's not really a craft movement, a craft moment.
Right. Yeah, exactly. When the Native Americans and the people from Africa and people of African descent mixed here in colonial times in Virginia, and the indentured servants came along, the cooking techniques were very similar, apparently, between the Native Americans and the people of African descent. But the recipes, the basis of the recipes, right, like the original Virginia barbecue sauce, which was vinegar, butter, red pepper, and salt. All of those things were recorded, and I found a ship's manifest from 1615 that included a cookbook that was brought here in Virginia in 1615. And so I got a copy of that cookbook, and lo and behold, I found a recipe in it for roasted meats that called for a basting sauce of vinegar, salt, pepper, and it gave an option of mustard. So and butter, by the way. So these recipes kind of came out of these books. But then, right, what happened, like you said, what happened in 1619? The first enslaved Africans were brought to Virginia, and that ironically was the first time the House of Burgesses, or an elected government, a representative government, was brought here to North America. So you've got the politics, you've got the African Americans who are now enslaved, and you have people that politicians who want to garner votes. And so as people spread out in Virginia, they started holding what they originally called entertainments, right? And so these entertainments, they'd go out, they get drunk, they'd shoot guns, and they'd kill a pig or a deer, and they would have it barbecued. And then how do the politicians bring all these people from all these faraway places to share their message with them? They throw a barbecue. And the word barbecue, used as a barbecue to refer to an event, if I have found through a careful reading and study of the original of the old historical passages, calling an event where what we call a barbecue, using the word barbecue to refer to an event where barbecue meats are served, that is a uniquely American usage of that word. and it was picked up by other people in the world from Americans. We did not get it from no one in the Caribbean in the 1700s and 1800s cooked holding a barbecue. That's just not how they used the word. Americans were the only ones that were doing that. And it started in Virginia. There's a scholar, 19th century scholar named James, his last name is Dr. Trumbull. He wrote a whole thing about how the barbecue is a Virginian word because the way that we use it in our country was born in Virginia. And he said, unlike New England, where the caucus became the way of politicking, the barbecue was the Virginian way of politicking. And so,
and it's funny. It's funny today. They say two things you don't mix right now is barbecue and politics.
Yeah, right. Right.
But
you don't talk about religion. You don't talk about politics, and you don't talk about barbecue.
Yeah, I forgot the other one. Yeah, religion. And what was interesting, people call this sauce. Some people call it a mop. Some people call it a baste. The basic ingredients. These were all things that they could make.
Exactly.
And if you know about vinegar, vinegar is really a byproduct of making wine.
Yep.
Actually, something goes wrong during the fermentation, and so you have vinegar. So everything you had, vinegar, red pepper, they grew. There's definitely knowledge of like red pepper coming in on those slave ships from Africa.
Oh, yeah.
It's just so much there with these mop sauces. And when you start looking into the literature, you'll start seeing people, they always talk about they based it. And no matter where you go across the South, with this basic essential recipe, you always see vinegar, red pepper flakes. You may see butter or not see butter, and you see salt. But you see those ingredients at the base of most barbecue sauces in America.
Exactly right.
And I generally like to say the vinegar pepper-based barbecue sauce is the oldest sauce in America when you think about how it's. But it's I read in one book, Joe, it's sad what vinegar barbecue sauce was used for as well. It was used for a barbecue sauce, but it was also used as a way to inflict pain. And when they whipped slaves, they actually poured the same combination of ingredients into human flesh. And I have read that. I have a book that could back me up. When I read it, I kind of cringed. I cringed to myself because I like, this is torture. I mean, sometimes it's like some people say it's torture when you're eating it, but it's good torture. But I can only imagine what pouring vinegar, and they say it makes an antiseptic, but it's very painful.
No, they would even use the red pepper too. Mix it in there, not just the vinegar and salt. They go for the red pepper sometimes. Okay. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, it's horrendous.
So barbecue is over 400 years. Why do you think, I was in Virginia, and it kind of hurt my heart when I was in Virginia last fall. I was there for an event called Fire Flower Fort, and I was really looking forward to getting to see Virginia barbecue at this particular event or some representation of it, but I thought I was almost in Texas for a bit.
Yeah,
and
right.
Since I don't live there, I was just like, when I got back, I said, I'm going to write a post on it. I said, I really thought I was in Texas, and I would love to see Virginia barbecue in Virginia, and I think you'd be appropriate to kind of tell us what you think is, why is that?
Right. Yeah, I've got a lot of ideas on what's going on with that. I have to be careful how I say it because some people might take it the wrong way on what I think is going on. First of all, when it comes to Texas barbecue, it gets a lot of press, right? And people who write for magazines and newspapers and they're not necessarily barbecue aficionados, but they read these other publications and they think, oh, wow, that must be the cool thing. And they kind of just go with it. I'll give you an example. A couple of years ago, they had this thing called the North Carolina Barbecue Revival. And they had all these barbecue cooks coming there because North Carolina barbecue, has really been kind of, having a hard time lately. Sam Jones, the guys that run Skylight Inn, they opened up another barbecue restaurant, but they're not doing it old school North Carolina style. If you look at the barbecue sauces they have on the tables, it's, kind of sweet tomato stuff. It's not the vinegar and Texas Pete and stuff that they use at the Skylight Inn. But in that North Carolina Barbecue Revival, they had people there cooking in Texas style smoke roasters, right? Texas barbecue is kind of taking over in a lot of places. It's just the way it is. North Carolina, Virginia, You go to Charleston down South Carolina, you got Lewis Barbecue down there. Now, it tastes really good. It tastes really good.
I mean,
but it's not
it's really good.
But it's not a Southern thing, and it's not real barbecuing. And that's something people are going to find hard to understand. But when you roast meat, right, you have a fire and you put meat beside the fire, right? Barbecuing is coals, hot coals with meat above it. When you take a Texas-style pit, you put a fire in a firebox and you put the meat beside it that's in a chamber that collects the smoke. It's smoke roasting. It's not a Southern way of barbecuing, okay? So in Virginia specifically, right, the press is, you turn on a TV, you hear all about Central Texas barbecue, and the good news is there are a lot of people in this state that are doing real Virginia-style barbecue, and it's just delicious. And some of the people that are doing it have been doing it a very long time. And some of the people now that are doing it are actually trained chefs, and they take their cooking expertise and they apply it to these Virginian recipes. So what's going on in Virginia, I think it's going to be a growing thing. Virginians have never really bragged about the food, right? We have some delicious food. Brunswick Stew is as Virginian as it gets. It's not invented in food. But Virginians won't stand up for the fact that, hey, it's Virginian food. The same thing with barbecue, the same thing with so many other things. Hoe cakes, now, everybody talks about Maryland crab cakes. Virginians were eating crabs a long time before Maryland ever even existed. But so Virginia's never bragged about the barbecue. And like I said, you go to a barbecue restaurant in Virginia, you get barbecue.
I think that's part of it, Joe, honestly, right there. I think what you're talking about is really part of why Virginia barbecue is not celebrated. The media folks in Virginia, like, you have to toot your own horn sometimes.
You're right.
You really have to, brag about your product. And I will say Texas have done an amazing job with the Texas Monthly and hiring a barbecue editor. But I agree with you that barbecue, as I know it, is you have direct heat using coals. And when you look at all the literature, that's what everybody was doing. Can I say it's not good? Oh, it's good. It's delicious.
Yeah, it is.
But what I personally have a preference for is what I'm more familiar with, what I grew up eating. And also, barbecue is going to continue to change and evolve as America change and evolve, because the technology, the manufacturing capabilities that you possess, it lends itself for innovation. And for example, those pits in the ground that those enslaved Africans cooked on, at some point, when you could do better, when you could use cinder blocks and build above ground, why dig a hole?
Right.
It just made sense. Instead of using tree limbs, why not use metal pipes? So you got to think about all those innovations, and now you got welding and 3D printing and water jet and all those different types of technology. It really influences the barbecue as we know it. But if you're a purist or very traditional, you really know barbecue, you have to really know what barbecue is. And I'll say it like this: when I was growing up back home in South Carolina, if I tell somebody I was having barbecue at the house, I was specifically having a whole hog, but it wasn't grilled chicken, it wasn't ribs, it wasn't hot dogs, it wasn't sausage. Barbecue and grilling was two different things, but a lot of people today call barbecue grilling.
Yeah.
And
unfortunate.
It's unfortunate, but as times change, but that's the reason I believe our work is so important, so people understand what is rich and what is to be celebrated. Exactly. And there's a couple of dishes that go with barbecue, and you mentioned one in Brunswick Stew. Another one that's near and dear to my heart is barbecue hash.
Yeah.
And let me just say, like, the barbecue hash that people talk about today in South Carolina in particular, it's not the barbecue hash that I'm accustomed to. The barbecue hash that I'm accustomed to that is very traditional, which matches up with history, and the oldest form of barbecue is a liver and lights hash.
Right.
And what I mean by liver and lights, the liver and lights hog head hash. So you have the liver from the hog, the lights are the lungs, and you have the head. And the head, you boil all that down till the meat falls to bone and tender. And you take that and you season it and you put different things, spices in it. And in later years, they start mixing a tomato base, some kind of tomato-based sauce, or some people put a barbecue sauce in there. and they mix it all together. And some people grind it and some people chop it. But barbecue hashes, I knew it. It wasn't, we didn't put white potatoes in barbecue hash. That wasn't something in the part of South Carolina I grew up in, PD region. Now people are putting potatoes, they mix in beef, they mix in beef shoulder, they put in pork shoulder, but they're not sticking tradition. I understand people are not going to eat that in a restaurant sense all the time, but they have to realize what is really barbecue and what is barbecue hash. And so I want to kind of give you that tidbit of what really is barbecue hash. Just not you necessarily, but just the general audience. So they start talking about this resurgence on different things. And this Brunswick stew is another dish just like barbecue hash. And I think you shared with me earlier this week or last Saturday, I think. No, last Friday, we talked about Brunswick stew. And it was interesting when I was reading the description by Will Hertz from Going with the Wind. And in that Brunswick stew, when I was reading his description, it sounded a lot to me like barbecue hash.
Good point, because what happened is this, right? Virginians used to cook a lot of hash. I got an account of a guy from the turn of the 20th century where he used to make barbecue hash out here where I live, near where I live in Spotsylvania County. And he would use trimmings from ox and beef steer that he would barbecue. Also, people in town here where I live, we used to make hogshead hash. They used to make hogshead hash all the time. But now when you're talking about Brunswick stew in Georgia, Brunswick stew in Georgia was this liver and lights hash where they took this Virginia Brunswick stew recipes. It has tomato, corn, butter beans, and potatoes, and they put that in that hash, and they started calling it Brunswick stew. Okay, I'll give them that, but it's nothing. Virginians never did that. Virginians made hash and they made Brunswick stew. They never combined the two recipes. But you're exactly right. In Georgia, that is exactly what Brunswick stew was. In fact, I've got a recipe book that has a Georgia Brunswick stew recipe in it, and it calls for liver, it calls for offal, various different internal organ meats and that kind of thing. And it's a barbecue hash with Brunswick stew ingredients in it. But you're exactly right. In Virginia, the original Brunswick stew was a squirrel meat hash. It was a barbecue hash.
That's that squirrel. Yep. That's a good meat there too. So somebody commented, Joe, and I want to address this about Texas barbecue as a totally different heritage. You got to realize, I put a picture up on the stream so you can see Texas barbecue, and they cooking in pits. In eastern Texas, like the Beaumont region, they were cooking in direct heat pits.
Exactly right.
When you think about modern examples of people in eastern Texas and the rest of the South, this Central Texas barbecue thing that people like the indirect smokers, that's a very new school phenomenon. Barbacoa, when they cook those heads in the ground, is something special too. And I agree, that's very Mexican in origin, if you want to say something. But when you talking about Texas barbecue, you have to start looking at the boundaries of eastern Texas. And when you look at eastern Texas, like the Beaumont area, they cooking with direct heat pits. And the only two people who I really know that really still cooking direct heat pits, the most celebrated person who do that is Miss Tootsie Snowden, I believe her name.
Miss Tootsie Tominetz, that Snow's Barbecue in Lexington. Mm-hmm. He cooks her ribs with direct.
And she's one of the most famous examples of that, of cooking direct heat pits. But this picture shows you in eastern Texas that they cooking in the ground, in pits, just like the rest of the South.
Yep.
And then this map here clearly breaks down the eastern Texas part of it. And if you look at this 1860s map, this tells you where slavery was located at. And I just wanted to kind of address that Texas barbecue. Yeah, it may be a beef thing now, but at one point, they was cooking in direct heat pits, not indirect as you see so much today.
Exactly.
So I just wanted to kind of address that. But brisket and beef is good. And I would tell you, the literature said, when I went to cook a whole cow, and I referenced this book a lot, Joseph Haynes' book, in the literature, they told me barbecue beef was the best meat that you could possibly eat. And when I cooked the barbecue whole cow, I agree. And I'm not being biased because I cooked it, but it was really the best piece of barbecue I ever tasted in my life.
Wow.
And a number of people in the country had the opportunity to witness me cooking a whole cow, using a pit cook method, where you also rotate the animal throughout the cooking process, not on a rotisserie, but periodically, just like the history books say. They said that was the sweetest meat. And I agree, it was the sweetest meat.
Wow.
So I don't know when I'm going to cook one again, but I can guarantee the only reason I want to cook it again is because of the flavor and the taste that I savored at that moment in time.
Wow. That's pretty awesome.
So nobody in my community ever cooked a whole cow before, Joe. And so I had to piece the story together. And that's kind of how I attacked this thing with studying barbecue. Is I studied barbecue in a way like how I got a PhD in engineering. In engineering, when you get a PhD, you have to study some theory, but you also have to do some practical testing or experimentation.
Yep.
And so that's kind of how I went about attacking this whole study of Southern barbecue, so I could really have an understanding of what it was. Well, first and foremost, I had a deep level of oral history, but as a true scholar, I knew I would be challenged if I didn't back it up with scholastic research. And that's how I came about your work. And so I think I want to know, like, how you approach your research and studying the history of barbecue and studying barbecue. I think you said something one time to me. You studied using the 5 C's.
Yep. Yeah, my approach is pretty much like doing graduate studies, right? I do a literature review. I do experimentation. And the results of my experimentation are what I consider to be research. Just like what you do, right? Your practical part of your dissertation was your research. You're learning something no one knows, right? You can't read it in a book. It's something that you have learned, right? Fourth. And so my approach was to do that. I did literature review. I did experimentation. I did interviews with people. But when I approach a historical passage, I do use the 5 C's approach that historians have created, and it's essentially where you pay attention to the context of the passage.
Joe, can you say that again, Joe? Because you're breaking up a little bit.
Sorry about that. Yeah, when I study the historical passage, right, I do apply the 5 C's that historians have given us for being able to interpret history, right, and that has to do with the context of the passage, right? Who's writing it? Who are they writing it for? Right? What's the time period? What other events are going on that are related to what's being written about? What did other writers say about the same subject of the same era? The causes behind it, right? So there's a whole list of things here. I can give you an example if I can pull one up here quickly. But so that's kind of my approach, and I've always felt that.
Joe, you're breaking up a little bit.
Oh, sorry about that. I've always felt that anything that's been found, you can find in a book. That's really you learning, and that's like literature review. It's not really,
Joe, I can't. Joe, can't hear you.
Okay, how about now? Can you hear me now? Okay.
Can you go back about 30 seconds, I believe?
Okay. Yeah, my approach has always been whenever I'm reading something that someone else wrote about something, I don't consider it to be research. I'm learning from them, from their research. But when I do actual experimentation, I'm kind of recreating things and learning new. So I actually did several ways of cooking, barbecuing. Goes back from how Powhatan Indians.
Oh, Joe, can you make sure you're speaking to the mic?
I'm doing it again?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm actually, I did an experimentation on learning, recreating how Powhatan Indians cooked. Some of these things, they had different things that colonials referred to as barbecuing that Powhatans did. I also experimented, like, you had a picture of some Native Americans cooking on a grill and had these flames underneath the grill. And I experimented with that. Of course, it just burnt the wooden grill up. So that picture that was drawn back in the late 1500s of supposedly Native Americans barbecuing, there's just no way they could have done that. what I did learn is that this Native American way of quote unquote barbecuing, this Indian way of barbecuing that George Washington called it, they did start out with some flames. And that's when the meat was actually roasted and cooked. But then as the flames died down and went to coals, they would let it continue to set there and it would get dry and dry and drier. And then the smoke that would eventually be turned into a smoky fire, and they would smoke the meat to preserve it. And it turns out, though, it's very similar to what you mentioned there, right? Native Americans did not have set meal times. They had to have food ready to eat at any time whenever someone got hungry. So they always kept a pot of stew or soup cooking. And whenever someone would come in with a critter they happened to kill, like a squirrel or a rabbit or something, they just drop it in the pot. And whenever somebody was hungry, they'd go to the pot and they'd eat, right? And so sometimes the meat was a little tougher than others, right? If it's been sitting there for a long time, got real tender. They do the same thing with their grills. Of course, women did the cooking. They didn't have iron axes and stuff to break carcasses down. They threw whole carcasses on a grill. And when the meat got done, they could start eating it. But they keep it on that grill because that's how they preserved it, right? They would keep it at, it was like a barbecue grill crock pot. And the longer that meat sat there on that low and slow temperature, the more tender it would get. And so from that, Africans, I believe, had the same kind of traditions, people in Africa, and they brought them here. And they were similar to what the Native Americans were doing. And they both, with the help of Europeans with the recipes, created this new thing that is not exactly like African cooking, isn't exactly like Native American cooking. It certainly isn't exactly like European cooking, but it's a melding of all three to create something new, which is this Southern barbecuing. So my approach has always been to read literature, interview people, and do experimentation, and then sit back and reflect on all of these things and try to make heads and tails about how they kind of fit together.
Okay. I kind of did a lot of that myself with going back and cooking in the ground, cooking different animals. One thing people realize, when you're cooking whole hog barbecue or any of these animals, they ask how it came out at the end. If you get it to the point, like the whole cow, it came out tender, pull out, it was like pulled beef. So, and some of the literature said they pull it. Some of the historic literature said they also was able to slice it. If you know anything about cooking meat, when you cook meat, it pulls, it's thoroughly cooked when it's pulled. When those enslaved Africans were cooking back there on plantations, they did not have a thermometer like we have to be able to validate that their animals were getting to be 160 degrees, or the right internal meat temperatures. So they had to make sure that meat was cooked before anybody gets sick. If you, especially being in their position, if they didn't cook that meat right, then it was pain and punishment. One thing Joe said about, I want to make sure we also talk about is like these pits. And I think we didn't talk about it, but like, it was interesting. You shared with me about a pit that was actually uncovered, and I'm writing a blog post about it. It's in his book, but I'm writing a little more details about the pit. It was at Montpelier's plantation, which was owned by the Madison family, James Madison, the fourth president of the United States. And when you look at those pits, they had a particular configuration generally. There was, I think in that particular work, it was 18 inches deep. The pit that I used when I dig in the ground was about 2 feet deep. And the reason that we did a pit about 2 feet deep was we actually cover the animal up these days and time when we cook in the ground versus back then on the plantation. It was totally open pit cooked barbecue. It wasn't no piece of sheet metal or metal tin to kind of keep heat in, or sometimes you see guys in barbecue restaurants, some of the older ones have a piece of cardboard. They didn't have the luxury of having something they could put on top. So to compensate for that, and this is the science of me coming out, is to compensate for that heat adjustment, you've made the coals a little bit closer to the actual meat that you're cooking. Because otherwise, you will lose a lot of heat throughout the cooking process if you further away from it, or you'll take more heat to fill up. But when they was digging in the literature, when they was cooking a whole cow, it was a much bigger pit, but it also depends on how they were planning to turn that animal. And in the literature, it it was some literature where they cooked the cow whole or they half, but after cooking a cow, and we had it broken down into halves, so I understand why some of the literature said they cook it in quarters, because cooking a whole cow or cooking it in halves, that's a lot of meat to turn over by two individuals, and so I understand wholeheartedly why they went to cooking it in quarters.
Yep.
And so that is where experimentation comes into play and help you understand something.
Yep, definitely. No, that's for sure. And that's the kind of thing that that I think brings a lot of value to what you do and what you're going to be bringing out in your book as well. This aspect of barbecuing, I think, that's been neglected. What you're writing.
I believe the work I've been doing in barbecue has been neglected. I also believe and that's part of the reason. So I'm gonna do a coffee table book first, and I'm only gonna do a limited edition. I'm probably gonna do anywhere from 500 to 1,000 books. And the reason is I don't want to be a man. I want to be able to tell the truth of barbecue, and I know that media may not want to hear my truths because I have had publishers I have literary agents told me, like, your book on barbecue separates slavery, has too much tie to slavery, but you really can't talk about American barbecue without talking about slavery.
No, you can't.
It's like so many other things in America. You can't really not have that conversation. When you look, somebody asked a question, when you cook a whole hog or cow, are the intestines removed? Yes, all the innards or offals are removed. And generally, from historical measures, and even when passed down in my community, we use those things to make different dishes. And so people would make chitlins from the intestines if they had enough. They would make barbecue hash with the liver, lights, and the heart. And they just, like, everything was used. You got to think, everything when they was cooking when they was killing these animals, every part of that animal was used, even if it wasn't necessarily going to the big political rallies. And I think we didn't talk about this, and I think we need to go back and revisit this. Every part of that animal was used. And so, say for instance, you want to answer this question, Joe? I answer. It don't matter.
I'll go for it.
So when they have these political rallies for these presidents or these politicians or this plantation elite, they would cook 5 or 10 hogs, right? Or sheep or mutton or lamb, whatever they want to put up for the table for the guests to eat. But when the enslaved Africans were cooking, they weren't necessarily getting first cuts of that animal at that plantation event for the planters and the planter elite. So they would keep that organ meat and make delicious dishes with those. So you have to kind of think about that. And as we talk about today in this movement of, like, we need to eat all hog to tail or head to tail movement. This head to tail movement been going on a long time. People didn't waste food. It was always eating the whole animal. And I treat that, I generally, to this day and time, I don't like to kill an animal that I'm not going to eat all parts of it. And so for that reason, like, I don't really go deer hunting because if I'm not going to eat it, I'm not going to kill it. And that's just my way of thinking. So I generally try to cook every part of a hog or animal I am involved with. Even if I go to a national event and somebody invite me, I'm going to cook what is per the history. And also I'm not going to allow anything to go to waste, just so you can have a real deeper sense of what you can have. But now the USDA, for example, don't allow you to have lungs. So I can't cook that, but everything else I will cook if the USDA allow you to do it.
Yeah. No, exactly. Yep.
So you said you got a book coming out, Joe. This is one thing I want to talk about. I think we maybe didn't talk about it enough. Is this, we kind of skimmed over it. These two cultures here, farming and moonshine, these two cultures really are intrinsically connected to barbecue. I really, when I look at old school barbecue, when I think about when I was a child, anytime people generally cook barbecue, they always had liquor available.
Yeah. Yep.
And so what you see here, these farmers in a cotton field, and this figure to the right is an old liquor still, like it after being busted.
Yep.
It is an old liquor still, I know that. But you can't separate this logic. You've got to have this conversation.
Right.
And I think to be able to really truly understand barbecue like you and I know it, other people could attack it and look at it as a researcher, but you actually have lived the experience, Joe, and I have lived the experience. I maybe come from a different perspective, a little different state. In South Carolina, you're coming from Virginia, but there's a lot of similarities, but there's a lot of differences, and there's a lot of nuances. And I think when you live something, you get a firsthand knowledge and appreciation of it. And I think what you're doing and what I'm doing, we want to make sure that real factual information goes out to the public.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. Growing up in a situation, see, here's the thing, and you know exactly what I'm talking about when I say this. We were not taught barbecue. We learned barbecuing, right? No one set us down one day and said, now Howard, let me explain something to you. Cooking hamburgers and hot dogs on a charcoal grill is not barbecue. No one had to set us down and explain that to us, right? We learned it because it's cultural, right? It's part of the culture. You don't really teach culture. Children learn culture, right? There's a fine line there. Now, the point that you're making is where you have the barbecue culture among farmers and the moonshine and that kind of thing. There's a fellow named Sokolov that wrote a book a few years ago called Fading Feast. And in that book, he documented how these traditions, these cultural traditions like barbecuing, Brunswick stew, burgoo, barbecue hash, how these things are all best preserved in a rural setting. That when places become urban and they begin to have big towns and cities, these kinds of traditions of traditional Southern barbecuing, Brunswick stew, barbecue hash, those kinds of things kind of go by the wayside for whatever reason. I don't know, but Sokolov had a really good handle on it. The book is entitled Fading Feast. It's an excellent book.
I think you faded, Joe.
I'm sorry.
I think you faded, but I think let me piggyback on something you said there that I think is important. I think you said the book Fading Feast talks about the rural impacts on saving these traditions and culture.
Right.
What I would say, if I didn't grow up in a rural community that I grew up in South Carolina, like I wouldn't have been aware of these traditions into the richness and the depth of it.
Exactly.
And because you just walk outside the house and you see your father cooking a hog for either the family or for the church, it becomes a second nature. It wasn't really, but I think one of the greatest thing I enjoy particularly about barbecue and growing up in a rural environment, the sense of community and fellowship that you get around this dish.
Right.
I know we talk a lot about a lot of deep history in this thing, and it may be painful history to some that really want to accept that, but what I also want to say is the fellowship aspect of it and the community is something that barbecue has a very unique power.
Right.
I believe barbecue has proven throughout history in the recent years that it is one of the few things that could bring people of different cultures and backgrounds together.
Exactly.
Even in the most racist South, during the Jim Crow era, I have been to restaurant owners who have said to me, I have had white people come into my community to eat barbecue.
Right.
And they didn't mind going unquote into the bad side of town or the rough side of the neighborhood to eat barbecue. And that was pretty significant. And it just kind of tells me it's just the overall power of barbecue and how it can change lives.
No, exactly. And I think going back to your point about being family and community, when you're, a lot of folks, and it's not a bad thing, people that weren't born in a barbecue community that discovered barbecue late and found it to be extremely delicious, that's not a bad thing. But people, I think, my opinion, people like you, people like me who were born into this thing where, I'd walk out, I'm a kid, 5, 6, 7-year-old kid, walk out in the backyard and you see 3 smokehouses, right? Just stuff you take for granted. When you're born into it like that, barbecuing to me, and I believe to you, it's not a food. It's a part of our lives. It is a meaningful part of our lives that connects us to each other, even though we're not, even though we're not family, but from our families and our community. I think that is a glue there. It's a connection that we all have, and that when we look at each other and we say barbecue, we have the exact same thoughts and feelings, and it just evokes all of these things. And so to me, being born in a barbecuing tradition, what I call a barbecue native, it just has a far deeper meaning than just a food or just eating. That's kind of how I look at it anyway.
No, I look at it the same way. I mean, and that's the reason I do this work, because honestly, Joe, I think you like me, if we did this work for our monetary to provide food for our families, we would be broke. I mean, I know I'd be broke for sure.
Pretty bad. Unfortunately, that's true.
I mean, so I do this work because I love it. I really appreciate Joe taking time this evening to join me on this conversation. I know we probably went deep, but we could probably spend hours talking about this kind of conversation on different topics. We really ain't scratched the surface. We really ain't stretched the surface. We really, honestly, we did not stretch the surface at all. I think we gave you all what we thought was a good, deep history of barbecue, but it's so much more to go there. There's so many more visuals that you could see and gain. Joe has a lot of pictures in his background, so I really hope you paid attention to those. If this is something you think might be informative, put comments in the questions. Let us know if you think you want Joe and myself to do this again on another topic related to barbecue, because I think, like me and Joe, want to make sure that if y'all want to let Joe talk the whole hour about Virginia barbecue and break down the regions of Virginia barbecue, and maybe I'll come back and sit down and talk about the regions or sub-regions within South Carolina, I will do that. I mean, I have some work on like online digital videos, and if you want me to answer you want to look at those videos and me answer questions about why I did certain things certain ways. Generally, everything I did is tied to history or some cultural element, so I'll explain that to you. But if y'all think y'all really want us to do this, let us know. We're trying this out, this technology. I hope everyone is practicing social distancing. So y'all probably look kind of rough. I know I do, but I thought it was more important for this information. And I really couldn't find, Joe is probably the most knowledgeable person in barbecue in this country, I believe, outside of myself. So I really am glad to have this conversation with him. That's pretty much it. I think that's pretty much it.
No, I appreciate.
I don't have anything else to add.
No, I appreciate the opportunity. I appreciate your love and of Southern barbecuing and the incredible knowledge you have of it. And I'm looking forward to your book. And hopefully we'll be able to get a chance to do something like this again soon.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to your book as well. Can't wait for it. In the meanwhile, y'all should check out all our works online. You Google my name, you Google Joe's name, you can Google some books he has. I encourage you all to just support. This is important work we're doing. So thank you all. Have a good evening, and we'll talk to you later.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good one.